Believe it or not, this is the all-new BMW X3, reloaded with a brand new powertrain, fantastic new set of specs, and a price that finally justifies itself. Now, this X3 that we have here is the first of the new generation, therefore making this the new X3 20 xDrive M Sport. And the badging at the back is now a little bit cleaner. Now, the price for this is officially 348,700 ringgit if you include the 5-year unlimited mileage warranty as well as service package. Although without that, the price drops down to 320,800 ringgit. Now, more importantly, what's going on under the bonnet is brand new, because while this is the same B48 turbocharged 2-litre 4-cylinder producing 190 PS and 310 Newton meters of torque, there is now also an extra little bit of mild hybrid electrification, making an additional 18 PS and 200 Newton meters from that integrated starter generator. As a result, 0 to 100 is completed in just 7.8 seconds, while the top speed remains at 215 kilometers an hour. Now, for this debut model, the X3 will be made available solely in M Sport guise, which is why this car in particular looks quite aggressive. Now, some of the standard features on this car include full LED headlights replete with the new age BMW LED indicators as well as automatic high beam. We also get a more assertive front grille replete with the iconic glow, which is basically an LED strip that outlines the kidney grille. We get an M Sport bumper replete with a little bit more contrast material on the front in order to make this car look a little bit more menacing. And what has been updated for this new generation is in terms of aerodynamics, because now, in addition to about half the grille being covered up, we also get functional air breathers down the side in order to smooth airflow over the front wheels. Now, one thing that you may notice from this angle is also the fact that the overall design language of this car has very significantly changed from the previous generation. We are now seeing the BMW X3 adopt a very similar design language to what we first saw from the BMW iX, and has since trickled down into the i7 as well as the i5. And so this car now has a much more assertive front end with far fewer lines, giving it a more monolithic look. That monolithic look continues down the side because you can see there are precious few body lines on this car, save for a couple of lines around the wheel arches and a single swage line which continues all the way to the rear. Aside from that, there are, again, very few lines on this car. And as a result, again, it makes this car look like it's hewn from a singular piece of granite as opposed to being full of complex surfacing as we've seen from BMW previously. Now, rolling stock is handled by a set of 19-inch alloy wheels, M Sport units at that, wrapped in Continental Eco-Contact 6Q tires for reduced rolling resistance and reduced road noise. Now, as far as I'm concerned, this is a pretty powerful, pretty punchy SUV, and with all-wheel drive, you will need a little bit more grip, and so the choice of Eco-Contact tires is a little bit curious. Now, because this is an M Sport model, naturally we get the shadow line pack as standard, which is why the roof rails as well as the window surrounds are done in gloss black. Now, in terms of the wing mirror caps, mercifully those are body color, but more importantly, the door handles on this car now follow what we've seen from other newer BMW models, where they sit flush against the bodywork but can lift up quite easily at that. Now, of course, this car also comes with a bunch of touch-sensitive buttons, which is part of the reason why it's just locked itself. But more importantly, you can merely open the door quite easily like that, as opposed to what we've seen from, say, the BMW iX, where it's sort of recessed into the body panel. Now, beyond that, the side profile of this car is still very familiar as a BMW X3. And in fact, what I do appreciate is the fact this car seems to differentiate itself a little bit more significantly from the BMW X5 and the BMW X1, giving this car its own unique identity. Although one of the best features, I think, on this car are actually these little panels here on the side, which act as side markers, but more importantly, the design integrated within them just looks quite smart. It's a nice detail. Now, that interesting light design on the side bleeds toward the rear, where again we get these new T-shaped style taillights, which are again emblematic to what we've seen from newer age BMW SUVs, and I do think this does look quite good. Now, one of the interesting features to me is the fact that even though this is the X3, the number plate recess lives down here. Now, normally BMW puts a number plate recess for coupes on the bumper, whereas their regular cars live up here, but evidently they're shaking things up because it's BMW. Now, because it's an M Sport model, again, we get an M Sport rear bumper, which is why we get more of that contrasting panel all the way down here in order to break up that monotony, but I can say the surfacing at the rear is quite complex, which does sort of help to break up the monotony of the metalwork back here. There is a pert little spoiler here, as well as a very small rear window, but more importantly, the angle of it is actually quite upright, which is meant to maximize boot space. Because back here, if I can find the button, there is a pretty good amount of space for what is ultimately meant to be a compact SUV. Simply because, given that this is a 5-seater, there is more than enough space for 5 people's worth of luggage in here without any issue whatsoever. On top of that, there is a little bit of space underneath the boot floor for smaller items, if you're trying to hide a pair of shoes, for example. There are also recesses on either side, one side with netting, and you get a 12-volt socket, you get hooks, and you can fold the rear seats 40-20-40 for added practicality. Plus, you can actually fold those seats from there. Sorry, I just assumed that there were buttons in here because it's a BMW. Now, aside from that, of course, you get this very solid parcel shelf, which is always nice to see. And of course, the powered tailgate comes as standard because this is a X3, which costs more than 300,000 ringgit. And so I think that if I had to open and close my own boot, that would be a little bit offensive, don't you think? Now, the interior of the X3 has been given a thorough makeover as fitting a brand new generation, which is why we get a brand new dashboard architecture, which is a little bit more shallow than I remember it to be. But they are flanked on either side by rather discreet looking air conditioning vents on either side, as well as this very thin air conditioning vent down here. Now, one thing that I do find interesting is that they've integrated the interaction bar that we first saw from the BMW 5 Series with one illuminated bar here, as well as these illuminated rings on either door pocket, or door card rather. Now, these actually serve a function with your safe exit warning. So if you open your door when there is an oncoming vehicle, it will flash red, which is nice to see. And of course, if you hit the hazards, everything blinks in red. Now, aside from that, these are also touch sensitive panels, which is why here it controls your airflow, whereas the airflow is controlled on this side via a separate plastic touch panel. Now, I'd like to talk about this panel because at first I thought it was just touch, but as it turns out, it does function as a button because it also functions as your door lock and unlock, as well as your memory functionality, all on this little panel here, which I think is an interesting idea, but the execution is less than ideal. But anyway. Now, moving beyond all of that, I do appreciate the fact that even though all the air conditioning vents have been minimized in terms of their visual mass, they've still retained manual functionality for the vents themselves, just like what we saw from the BMW i5, which is always nice to see. And moving further down, there are things like your cup holders, a wireless charging pad, as well as a random space on this side, 2 USB-C ports. And moving down here, you get your controls. So on this side is your iDrive functionality, and on this side, this is your gear selector, reduced down to just this little nub. Now, moving back here, you have a decently sized center console bin, which is about that wide and about a little bit longer, and it's not all that deep, but your 12-volt socket lives in there, and it's covered by this nice leather-wrapped center armrest. And overall, I think in terms of practicality, this car is just about fine. You've got a decently sized glove box here, lined in felt. You've got decently sized door bins, big enough for a 1.5 litre size bottle, as well as some more flotsam behind that. And overall, it does seem decently practical, but I think the best takeaway about this car is the overall design, because I do think that it does look more upmarket than the outgoing car, and it integrates a lot of the functionality that we saw from newer BMWs or earlier introduced new generation BMWs into the X3 rather seamlessly. Now, of course, you do get 2 electric seats on either side, replete with bolster support for the driver and a manually extendable under thigh support here, which is always nice to see. And of course, because it's an M Sport car, you get M Sport badging here, you get a boost pedal here, along with your paddle shifters to manipulate the 8-speed automatic gearbox, and you even get an M badge here in the middle between the cup holders, which I think is very interesting. Now, beyond that, of course, we have to talk about the tech. So obviously this car is running the very latest operating system from BMW, and of course it has been refined ever so slightly. So instead of the individual tiles that we first saw from like the BMW iX, now we get this one sort of separate panel here, which you can swipe up and down to see the variety of different options. Of course, this is individually customizable should you want it. Of course, swiping left and right does nothing anymore, but swiping down from the top will reveal some shortcuts which are customizable. And of course, you can hit the app drawer in this car, which then reveals everything. This has not really been fixed, because as you can see, all of these tiles just look very similar and they're very difficult to differentiate visually, which means that if you're trying to manipulate this on the go, it's going to be a bit difficult. Now, For your granular air conditioning controls, unfortunately, they do live in the screen. So to adjust your air controls, for example, to adjust your automatic functionality and so on, that all lives in here. And of course, your temperature controls, however, live on this panel down here. So even if you do use Android Auto, you still have your temperature control down here. Now, in terms of Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, it is completely wireless, which means that you don't need a cable running around. You can use the wireless charging pad. And of course, this is a very snappy system indeed, even when you're using it wirelessly. And of course, the car does come with its own built-in navigation, but of course, this is relatively limited in terms of its functionality. So use that at your own peril. The instrument cluster up ahead of me is pretty much okay. It's got the same problems that we've seen before from other BMW digital instrument clusters, where it's not very customizable, and of course the information is a little bit trickier to find than you might expect. But I am slowly getting used to the controls, which means that manipulating this screen as well as my full color heads-up display is starting to get a bit easier, which leads me to believe that this is one of those systems where you just have to get used to it and then it's fine. What I can't get used to, however, is the fact that this new steering wheel design now integrates the new set of BMW controls, where, as you can see on this side, you have controls for the adaptive cruise control. Now, this allows you to switch it on and off, and the other one allows you to adjust the speed. However, to adjust the distance, if I were driving at the moment, I have to go into the app drawer, find my control for driving settings, go into driver assistance, go into driving, and then find my distance control, and then adjust it from there. Now, I find this irritating, but I think that most people would find it irritating because distance control is something that you will manipulate quite frequently. For example, if I'm driving in town, I prefer a shorter distance. If I drive over a longer distance, I prefer a further distance, so the car's looking further ahead and it slows down well ahead of a slower moving vehicle ahead of me. And the fact that I have to go through so many different menus and so many different layers just to adjust my distance is ridiculous. And it's made worse by the fact that on this side, there are buttons flanking that little scroll wheel, whereas on this side, there is a space where they could have integrated the distance control, but they haven't. In fact, if this was a manipulatable button, just like one of those star favorite buttons, that would have been fine, but no, this does nothing. It clicks even, but it does nothing. I don't get it. Now, beyond that, there is a self-dimming rear view mirror, and that manipulates not only this mirror, but also your right side outer mirror, which is always nice to see. And overall, I do think this interior is fine. I just wish there was one extra button. Now, the back of the X3 is actually a surprisingly spacious place to be. With the front seats are in my driving position, about 170 centimeters, I have a huge amount of knee room and a pretty good amount of headroom. No doubt as a result of this car not being offered with any kind of sunroof or panoramic roof, which means that life back here is pretty good. I've got a decent amount of under-thigh support, and there's plenty of space to tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me. I do have this deployable center armrest with a couple of cup holders, and it feels nice and sturdy. I've got decently sized door bins, again, big enough for a 1.5 litre size bottle, and some smaller pockets up here for like random small items. There's netting behind the front seats. There's even these little expandable spaces behind the backrest where you can buy accessories for this car, like a coat hook or an iPad holder, for example, which is great, which means that if you have kids, you could buy the iPad holder and they can plug them into the 2 USB-C ports that are sat down there. Now, in terms of the overall specification back here, life is not that bad because, again, everything here is pretty much all right. You get a couple of rear air conditioning vents or crotch coolers because they are set quite low, but you do have your own climate space back here, which means that you control your fan speed as well as your temperature via a touch panel set down there. It's a little bit awkward to get to, but it does work, and so that's always nice to see. Now, if you do have children in the back, you'll appreciate the fact the ISOFIX mounts on this car are very, very easy to locate, although the doors themselves are not that big, which means that a bulky rear-facing child seat will be a little bit of a challenge back here. But once you do get a child seat back here, the window line on this car is not that high, which means that you do get a decent view out, and overall, life back here is pretty good for children, and for adults, if you have two back here, it should be fine. But a third passenger in the rear will not appreciate life so much because there is a pretty pronounced center tunnel as a result of this car being an xDrive all-wheel drive model, and the center seat, while it is decently wide, is quite flat, and so in order to enjoy any degree of comfort, you will be impeding on the two outer passengers, and of course I suspect that shoulder room is not going to be all that great either. But the thing about this new X3 is it is a mild hybrid 48-volt system using the B48 2-litre 4-cylinder that we've seen in a myriad of other cars. And so to me, the bigger question with a car of this size is, while it is a practical, compact family SUV, does it still drive like a BMW? The thing about this X3 is this is ultimately a all-new generation for this car, which means that it does integrate a few new things that we've become more familiar with other models within the BMW lineup. And so this car is a mix of the familiar and the unfamiliar. But one thing that is, or rather remains very familiar, is the driving experience. So from behind the wheel, this BMW X3 feels like every bit a BMW. There is no concern of this car feeling like it's based off a front-wheel drive platform, because from the driver's seat, this car still drives with that same sort of je ne sais quoi that you just only get in a BMW. The steering wheel, for example, is very reasonably and very naturally weighted, and it does remain quite weighty no matter what. And so that gives you this sense of solidity from behind the wheel. That is always reassuring when you're behind the wheel of a BMW. And even though this car does run a 48-volt mild hybrid system, which perhaps might sound a little bit alien to quite a few people, what I can tell you is that the way this system works in this car is that it always feels like the way it's supposed to. It feels like any turbocharged, a regular turbocharged BMW. It's just that that integrated starter generator does help to provide a little bit of extra boost, about 200 Newton meters extra torque when you do need a little bit just to overtake, or if you're climbing hills, for example. And having experienced that for myself, I can say that it does work with a certain degree of usability. Now, in terms of overall comfort, the BMW X3 is a very well-judged machine. At no point does this suspension, for example, feel like it's too crashy, and yet there seems to be zero compromise in terms of the overall dynamics of the car. If you drive this car intently, you will realize that there is significant amounts of BMW DNA in this car, as there rightfully should, which is why body control is kept to a very natural sort of minimum, where there is some lean, but it's always in a way that feels very forgiving and very informative for the driver. However, in doing so, they have not compromised on this car's secondary ride, and so at no point does it feel like you go crashing over potholes or speed bumps. This car just works very well in order to insulate you from the world around you, and even on the very worst that PJ can offer, for example, at no point have I been made to feel uncomfortable behind the wheel of the X3. Now, one of the things that the X3 wasn't particularly good at in its previous generation was actually in terms of overall refinement. The outgoing model was a little bit loud and a little bit coarse, and so for this model or this generation they have sought to address that somewhat. So for example, while the engine remains decently vocal, at least as much as you would expect from a vehicle of this class and of this nature, in terms of wind noise, this car is now significantly quieter than the model that it replaces, which means that when you are trying to cover distance, this car does feel a little bit more isolating, a little bit quieter, and you feel a little bit more serene behind the wheel, and that is something that you'll be able to enjoy not just as a driver but also as a passenger within the car. On top of that, in terms of road noise, it has been addressed by making it a little bit more refined and a little bit quieter, but this car isn't quite the quietest we've seen yet. If you were to compare the X3 to something like an Audi Q5, that car does seem a lot quieter than this BMW, but of course that is a significantly more expensive car, and so naturally your expectations tend to be a little bit higher anyway. But more importantly, the sense of response that you get from this powertrain remains something that I think a lot of people are really going to enjoy. This powertrain setup feels incredibly responsive and incredibly reactive to driver input. And when you pair that with this very natural feeling steering wheel with very usable weight, it just feels like a car that you can cover a great amount of distance in with a certain degree of confidence. And that is helped further by the fact that this car is available in our market with xDrive all-wheel drive, which means that no matter how difficult the situation might get, no matter how slippery the roads might be as a result of our torrential rain, no matter what, this car always feels planted and safe, and that's exactly what you want from a vehicle like this. Now, the other big improvement actually comes in terms of safety, because BMW has been doing this thing for a long time where they've kind of held back in terms of the active safety tech on their cars, but it appears that things are now changing for the better. So for example, this new X3 now comes with the full suite of active safety features from BMW, which means things like adaptive cruise control, autonomous emergency braking, lane keep assist, lane centering, blind spot monitoring, a really good 360-degree camera, as well as the reverse parking assistant in order to help reverse you out of difficult situations. All of these now come as standard with the new X3 20i xDrive M Sport, which is great because this car with the 5-year service plan does push 360 grand, which means that you would want to have all of these features included for your near 400,000 ringgit spend. And the fact that all these systems work really well does again give you a sense of confidence, a heightened sense of confidence. The only drawback being that, like I mentioned earlier, adjusting the follow distance in this car requires you to dabble into the screen, where rightfully it should just be a button on the steering wheel. But overall, I don't think that these are all detractions for what is ultimately a very well put together, very well sorted package from BMW. The X3 is ultimately targeted at younger families who are looking for potentially their first premium SUV experience, and so I do think that the BMW X3 in its current guise does play that role very well. This interior is well appointed. There are lots of really nice flashy look at me bits, but more importantly, the car feels like a proper premium experience, and now with more comprehensive equipment all the way around, it just feels like this is the car it was always meant to be. And when you pair that to the fact this car also gets fantastic fuel economy, averaging about 7.3 liters per 100, despite long fast drives and long fast traffic jams, that fuel economy does represent something that you'll be able to get in the real world, and that to me makes this a very solid package. However, if you are looking to buy a car that is more likely to make the neighbor's curtains twitch, then perhaps the Mercedes-Benz GLC, also updated in a new generation, might be a little bit more your bag. Although that said, that car is not as comprehensively equipped as what you get from the X3. And if driving dynamics is not quite so important to you, then the Volvo XC60 remains an absolutely excellent proposition. Now, the most popular Volvo in history, that car does offer a little bit more in terms of firepower with its plug-in hybrid powertrain, and also a little bit more in terms of overall savings, again, because of that plug-in hybrid powertrain. But if you do not want to be fussed with plugging your car in order to eke out a little bit of range, and more importantly, if you just want a car that is a little bit more of a get in and go kind of affair, then the BMW X3 remains an absolutely excellent contender. And so that concludes our review of the 2025 BMW X3 20i xDrive M Sport. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including the link to join our new WhatsApp channel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.